Hi, everyone. Welcome to our webinar today. Thanks for joining and making the time as we talk about the Microsoft 365 audit trail. We're really excited to share this with you. Before I get into that, I'll just go mention a couple of our standard housekeeping notes. And that is, you should see on your right-hand side, there is a Q&A panel. So just make sure you can find that. You can ask questions throughout the webinar, and we'll get to as many as we can at the end. If we don't get to everything, we will send out a summary of any questions we can answer today. We'll also be sharing a recording and the presentation, so you'll get that after our webinar as well. So what we're going to go over today is a brief history of the audit trail and auditing in SharePoint and the overall broader ecosystem in the Microsoft 365 world. We'll talk about what the platform offers in terms of audit trails, what kind of information we can get, how do we get that information, and then we'll also sort of go through why some of those audit trails matter, what the so what is behind the audit trail. And then we'll go through some gaps and issues, considerations for compliance, and then talk about a product that we've developed to help with managing the audit trail called Gravity MOAT. And as I said, we'll have some time at the end for some questions. So just so you know who I am, my name is Jazz, and I work on some of our business development offerings and marketing here at Gravity Union. I have been working in this field in employee portals and SharePoint and Microsoft for a while now, over 15 years. And in a past life, I was a designer, still love design, still very passionate about user experience. And I'll pass it over to Michael.
Thanks, Jazz. I'm Michael Schweitzer. I'm the president and CEO of Gravity Union. I've been working on large-scale Office 365 and SharePoint digital transformations for a long time. I think give you a little background on the company. So we're sort of a compliance-focused Microsoft partner, helping organizations move into the cloud, make sure we're getting high adoption, and making sure we're managing that content from a compliance perspective. Also a notable great place to work if you're looking for a job. Luckily enough, we're also a content services provider. So my video for 1 second. And we're Microsoft partner rather, which means we're sort of a special organization that works closely with Microsoft on all things SharePoint and OneDrive and compliance and Office 365, and we get to sort of insight into the roadmap and give them feedback and some fun stats about us as an organization that you can look at later. So just make sure we level set, talking about what is an audit trail. An audit trail is a log of events in an application, everything from logging in to viewing a file to deleting a file, any action or activity. Anytime you click a mouse in Office 365, basically, Microsoft is capturing information about that event. It would include all the metadata around that, the who, the what, the when, the where, and the how of that event. To look at an actual event coming from Office 365, we can see that we've got the operation that the user had logged in. We can see, obviously the time and date stamp. We can see any information about that event, if it was a successful login. We can see who it was. We can see their IP address, and even what application did the login itself. So lots of information coming from the audit trail, lots of important information. So why are audit trails important? Well, we need to keep it to perhaps meet our needs around regulatory requirements. So depending on your jurisdiction and who you need to report to from a regulatory authority standpoint, you're often required to store those audit trail entries to prove who looked at a document, etc. If you need to provide evidence litigation for investigations. Understanding if you've had a compromised account, that we'll talk to you a little bit later as well. But if you get someone who's broken into your Office 365 environment, it may be important to understand what they were looking at and what they downloaded. You can also provide insight into adoption. So if you just rolled out some SharePoint sites or some teams, it could be useful to understand if it's been successfully adopted or if it has a low adoption, as well as to provide insight into compliance. And so, we got a whole bunch of research and background on why it's important. You can go do some Googling. Interestingly, yesterday while I was making this presentation, I got a fake email from someone who really wanted me to try and log in basically with my Office 365 credentials into a fake website so that then they could take my credentials and perhaps log into our site and then either put on some ransomware or download our intellectual property, or whatever it happens to be. I know that happens quite a bit. And interestingly too, like typically if you do get compromised or you get hacked, oftentimes you're not aware about it. for several years after the fact, which kind of drives home the importance of needing to hold on to that audit trail for a good period of time. Other real examples that I've had personal experience with we actually recently noticed a bunch of deletions in our own environment, and it turns out one of our employees was deleting all of the synchronized folders they had on their desktop that were pointed to SharePoint, not realizing you had to unsync those first, and so they had accidentally deleted a whole bunch of our project documents, and we were able to find that out and restore those, which is lucky for us. Working with one of our clients, they had a researcher quit a job, and we were able to go and find out they had downloaded a bunch of information on projects that they weren't even a part of before moving to the new employer. So they were able to send some scary legal language to their new employer about not going to market with those competing products. Working with a nuclear focused organization who has to adhere to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Act here up in Canada. And basically, verify that people were not viewing that really important content outside of the country. An overtime lawsuit proving out if someone had actually read the overtime policy, that they had to get approval for their overtime before actually working overtime. And even, in looking at an accidental death investigation in the oil and gas industry and looking to see if that procedure was being followed. So lots of other examples of when an audit trail can really come in handy. A brief history, if you're familiar with SharePoint and so the ecosystem with audit trails, you knew that historically it wasn't turned on by default. You had to go and turn it on, and oftentimes that was too late. It was quite limited, only giving you a handful of things. Turning on view from an audit trail can slow things down. And then really, you had to go to various locations and perhaps even use third-party add-ons to collect all the information. So if you needed a combination of understanding who was logged in and when they logged in and what they were looking at and what they were searching for, etc., I would have to pull information from Windows logs and Exchange logs and SharePoint logs, etc. So it was quite onerous to get that stuff. So it was really hard to consolidate that information, get it into one place and report on it. And your audit trails disappeared if your content moved around, for example, if archiving it back to a record center. It could be turned on and off, and so there's certainly a lack of integrity there. And oftentimes we see RFPs where people would like that functionality, but the reality is if you have the ability to turn on and off the audit trail, then it's no longer really an audit trail, because you can't be certain if you didn't capture something because it didn't happen or because the audit trail was turned off. And you typically needed several add-ons to complete that picture. So how does Microsoft 365 approach audit trails? They're giving you quite a bit more functionality. It's really one centralized place, a location for everything: SharePoint, Teams, OneDrive, any application in the broader Microsoft 365 environment. Getting every single activity, every mouse click, every view, every preview, everything is recorded in there. There's roughly 1,000 activity types and hundreds of different pieces of metadata that Office 365 is capturing. So with enough permissions, you can go to compliance.microsoft.com. And if you do that, in order to get to the audit trail, we'll see that we have a little audit trail button to the left-hand side. It may be hidden under a little more options button. And if we go look at the page, this is what the audit trail interface looks like. So you're able to specify some activities, some users, a date range, and drill into that audit trail and pull the information out. So what kind of information can we capture from the Microsoft 365 audit trail? So pretty much everything, and just some examples: failed login attempts, meetings started in Teams, file viewed, deleted from SharePoint, OneDrive, emails received. Pretty much everything that you can think about is captured. And I do have a screenshot, but I'll even actually open up the Compliance Center right now and just show you all the activities that they offer. So everything to do with files being created, folders being created, items being deleted, folders being copied, lists being created, sites being created, anything and everything you can think of, the audit trail offers. So it's a lot of information. Most of it's pretty useful. Some of it maybe not over a long period of time. Looking at the one note: when you are downloading the audit trail, so if you go to the audit trail and you add a bunch of information and filters and really figure out what you're looking for, if you're looking for information about a specific user or a specific document library, you're limited to 50,000 events per download, and they are in a JSON format, which is kind of a new format for data interchange. So again, looking at that, so I can go do a search here, kind of search for some information about myself, and you can see that I found some entries from Michael Schweitzer about a file being accessed in a certain time frame for a certain folder in marketing there. I'm able to download that information to an Excel document. And you'll see it's kind of simple. It's basically 4 columns there: the creation date, the user ID, the operation that were captured, and then we have all that information, which is basically baked into a big JSON string building out. If you were to view that properly, this is what we saw before. So see all the information that we get for each and every audit trail entry in the system. So talking about how else we can use audit trail information, governance examples. So we can certainly identify and manage those lists of sites, list libraries, and folders. And so you can create reports and see what's being created and where is it being created. Oftentimes, sites get created and the records management team isn't aware about it and they're not able to do their job properly. Or maybe you have some rogue sites somewhere that aren't following your standard information or architecture practices. We can identify unused or underused applications or sites or groups or libraries or lists. And so perhaps if we see some sites that were created aren't being used, we can go ahead and remove those and clean up our environment and make a better search experience and a better navigation experience and just make our overall implementation easier to manage. We can certainly identify where security protocols are not being followed. So for external sharing in our HR site, that could be a problem. If you've broken inheritance one too many times, that could potentially slow things down. So lots of ability for us to do some governance on the system. As an example, here's a report where we're showing you how many activities, edits, deletes, previews per SharePoint site. Kind of going down, and I just have a screenshot here, but if I was able to scroll down, I can see down towards the bottom, you'd have a bunch of sites that aren't being used anymore, and so you can go clean those up. Some security examples, we can identify external user activity. Interestingly, yeah, we found out last week that we had a project with a client and a year and a half ago, and they're still referencing our SharePoint site. So interesting that we need to go clean that up. We can report on access to sensitive information. So some of our clients would like to see, hey, I just want a list every month of people who are looking at our super sensitive files or HR files and being a bit proactive. We had one client who had restructured their security groups in Active Directory and had accidentally opened up everyone's personal HR information for the entire organization. And they had to kind of go take a look and see who was poking around. And luckily, no one had done that. But certainly both a proactive and a reactive sense is good to understand who's looking at your sensitive content. If people are looking at it from outside the jurisdiction that you don't expect. Right now I think a bunch of politicians are getting in trouble both in Canada and the States for traveling perhaps when they shouldn't be. So you can see if someone's working from Hawaii or Mexico or someplace warm and hot, we can all be jealous. And we can also perhaps help identify compromised accounts. So looking at failed login attempts and look to see if people are trying to hack stuff. So for example here, we can see that we've actually got, we can do a failed login attempt account. And so if we see those higher numbers, maybe it's a conversation to have with people and say, hey, just double checking, you seem to have a lot of failed logins. And does that seem right to you? Or do you think someone's trying to hack into your account? D. Spears is our IT administrator, so that certainly could be scary if someone is trying to hack into his account. From a compliance standpoint, we can certainly report on content perhaps that should be classified but isn't being classified, stuff that should have been declared but isn't declared yet, content that should have been disposed of, etc. To give an example, a bit of a report to show you the blue areas, content that's been classified against your file plan, versus the gray areas, the content that has been classified but not declared and locked down as a record yet. And then the orange area, stuff that hasn't been classified yet. And in this case, it was simply just a net new area of the solution that we hadn't applied records management to. So that kind of made sense, but give you some insight to your compliance. And then adoption. So, oftentimes you might be able to see, underused sites or overused sites, or maybe you can identify those sites that are used heavily and go dig into that and see why perhaps they're extra successful over other groups in the organization. So maybe it's their power users are better equipped, or they've had better training, where that happens to be. You can observe over time if your email or attachments are going down over time after you deploy Teams or Yammer. So lots of cool stuff you can do from that, and dig into your information about adoption and how you're getting value out of the system, and really perhaps demonstrating that ROI to higher ups and decision makers. So getting into some compliance considerations. So Microsoft does only keep the audit trail for 90 days or 1 year, depending on your license. We'll dig into it a little bit further. And so almost all of our clients right now are trying to deal with this by perhaps trying to download it on a daily basis, or figuring out or using some kind of backup tool. It's probably not enough to meet needs around compliance. And again, looking at that news article from before, oftentimes you're not even aware that something was compromised, or that you were hacked for a year or two into the future. So it's important information that you want to keep and hold on to for perhaps a longer period of time. So you will want to probably download it. You want to put it into a discoverable format. So for organizations that are downloading the Excel formats, you may end up with hundreds or thousands of download files, and it could be a little bit cumbersome to try and search, sort, and filter that information into a format that's easily digestible. So you certainly want to put that into some kind of database. Placing audit entry on hold. So if you are in litigation, or you have an FOI request or an ATIP request, etc., it may be important for you to be able to preserve those audit trail entries for the duration of litigation, for example. So you wouldn't want to lose critical audit trail information about documents in the middle of a lawsuit. So that could be something important to think about. And also the other thing is the notion of anonymizing or destroying the audit trail after the fact. So if you do have the audit trail around and you're keeping it, but your content has gone through disposition or destruction from a records management standpoint, it may be valuable to hold on to that information from an analytics standpoint to understand adoption and usage and compliance for that content. But perhaps you want to scrub out that PII, that personally identifiable information about people, i.e. remove their usernames from the audit trail. So I can keep the audit trail around. I'll know that a document was added, that it has so many views, that it was classified and declared, but I don't know who was doing those activities. So oftentimes, if you have the audit trail for a document, even though it's been destroyed, you may need to produce it as evidence in litigation or in the courts. So yeah, thinking about your strategy for how to manage the audit trail, keeping on to it for as long as you need, and do you want to destroy it at some point in the future, or do you want to anonymize it moving forward as well? Something certainly to think about. So looking at some gaps and issues in the Microsoft 365 audit trail. So there is this sort of disappearing audit. So E1, E3 licenses save the audit trail for 3 months. And that's in a per user scenario. So if some people have an E5, their audit trail entries are saved for a year. If some people have an E1 or E3, that's saved for 3 months. And then after that, it's simply dropped off, and there's no way to recover the audit trail. There are auto retention rules. So they have sort of to somewhat address this. If you have an E5, and I think later this year they'll come out with the actual license cost. What we've seen so far is it'll usually be an extra couple of bucks per user per month for additional functionality like this or like Project Cortex. But they do have some auto retention rules that allow you to build out additional rules to hold on to things. So notes about that: you can have a maximum of 50 audit log retention policies to store things for longer than 3 months or a year. You have to have an E5 plus get the audit add-on license as well. And then interesting, there's an interesting thing around the shortest rule wins. So you can have multiple rules being built out. And so let's say you have a rule that stores information for your CEO for 20 years, for example, because that could be really critical information. But you also have a rule that says, hey, destroy all email activities after 1 year. The shorter rule wins out, which I think is counterintuitive. So something certainly to keep an eye on. And you do have to get that additional license, which we'll find out the cost hopefully shortly in the next couple of months here in 2021. So looking at some of those audit retention rules, I can go into the system. You see the audit retention policies in the upper left-hand corner here right next to search. And I can give it a name, give it a description. I can specify users, specify the type of record. So is it a SharePoint view? Is it an email being sent, etc. And then the time frame for that. So again, some analytics, you only have 50 of them. So if you're going by user, you can only specify up to 50 users for that audit retention policy. Again, there's a 50,000 audit entry per download limit. So if you go into Office 365 and say, hey, give me all my audit entries for a given day, you may not be able to do that. From what we've seen, roughly the average user creates 300 to 400 events per day. So doing some quick math, if you had a company with 1,000 users, you'd be creating 400,000 daily audit events, and you'd have to split that up into 8 different downloads. So it can be kind of tricky. We have seen organizations kind of struggle to figure out, well, do I slice it by application? Because that'll make searching easier. Probably splitting it up by time makes the most sense. Maybe you do hourly, you can go and specify time if we look at the compliance area. But yeah, it's something to be aware about. So just making sure you're downloading stuff properly and splitting it up into bite-sized chunks of less than 50,000 items per download. So to go do a bit of an example, I can go, again, you can see this audit trail here, and you'll note that I have the start date and start time. This is probably the easiest way. Maybe I'll open up my browser again and show you what that would look like. So I could come here and put no qualifiers for my activities, my users, or my folders, or sites, or documents, etc. But simply provide a time, so I can go perhaps from midnight to 1 o'clock in the morning for a given date range, and then be able to download my content. And then yes, give me some kind of variable. I have to go double check that, but I can go do a search based on some kind of time frame. And oh, it's 2016. I gotcha. Gotcha. We need to be the 16th here. There we go. So I can do 1 hour chunks, and that might give me a nice bite size of information to download at a given point in time. I won't quite do a search right now because we may have some NDA information show up there. But yeah, that's sort of the area. So again, to get to this, we can go to compliance.microsoft.com if you have access. Once you have access, you can go to the audit area. That brings you to this main page. Again, I can search for certain activities. I can see every time a file was accessed, every time a file was checked in. So figure out what information do I really care about? Is it creating files or folders or libraries? We can specify certain users. You can also specify a certain location. So it could be a folder, it could be a URL, could be a site. And then we specify the time frame. Once we've done that, we can do a search that'll give us all the entries. And then once we have all the entries, we're able to do an export. We can save them somewhere, or we can also download them into an Excel format. And then from there, you'll probably want to take that Excel information and dump it into perhaps a central location, because it's relatively hard to report off of multiple Excel documents in one time using Power BI or some kind of analytics tool. So jumping back into the presentation. Yeah, so it can be a little bit difficult to report, do custom reports out of the box. They do offer some, certainly within Office 365, but you'll want to figure out some kind of database scenario and reporting scenario to really get the most value out of it. Again, not everyone has access, and oftentimes what we see is in order to get access to the audit trail, it means you're getting access to everything in the compliance suite, which may be exposing you to certain functionality that maybe you shouldn't have access to, like being able to do e-discovery across other sites and stuff like that. So oftentimes that'll be a request that have to goes into the IT department to be able to fetch that information. So that's a good kind of overview of the Microsoft 365 audit trail, the information, why it's important. And so, we do have a lot of clients that are kind of struggling with, trying to figure out how do they download all the information, get into the right location, report on it. So we did create kind of a small solution that we're going to start sharing out in the market. called Gravity MOAT. MOAT stands for the Microsoft Office 365 Audit Trail for archiving. It's going to store all the information in your Azure environment. So if you're not familiar with Azure, it's like Amazon Web Services. It's a cloud environment, has lots of different tools and applications, but really you get the ownership of that data and you'll have access to it and can do whatever you want with it. We do allow custom reports to be built, give you kind of complete control over that audit trail to be able to manage it properly. It is multilingual. And then we also allow access to the audit trail without needing access to the Microsoft 365 Compliance Center, which can be a benefit. For the technical people in the room, everything has been developed within Microsoft Azure, which is again, like the cloud environment. So we're using Cosmos DB, which is a NoSQL database, which basically means it's relatively unstructured, allowing the audit trail entries to change and adapt over time. We're using Azure Logs, Azure Bus Service, and queues for the high processing, so it kind of scales nicely for any size organization. There Azure Functions, where the main code is run. We're using Azure Key Vault for the storage of all really important information, and we have this application hosted in the Azure App Service. We do have some quick searches, some advanced searching, some reports, and then we can export everything to JSON XML if you have to give information to legal parties, etc. And then from a compliance standpoint, we can do auto delete. So we can do, you can say, hey, just delete everything from one drive because you don't care about that much after 2 years. We can anonymize the audit trail if need be. We can place your audit trail on legal holds. And again, what that looks like is if I have an audit trail entry, maybe it's valuable to keep that information, but I want to scrub out the personally identifiable information. I want to get rid of that username or the user ID so I can keep the high value information about adoption or what's been happening in our environment, and is our usage of email going down or up, etc. And without having the risk of having to expose other information in litigation. Or you could optionally delete it. We also have an API that allows you to do a lot of that stuff. So if you have a third-party records management tool, or you want to automatically do some of this stuff based on what's happening with Office 365 security compliance records management capabilities, or a third-party tool like Collab or CollabSpace, it'll allow you to do that. So we can give you a quick tour of the application, and if you're a large organization, you may want to build something yourself anyways, but certainly hopefully you'll have some good ideas on the types of capabilities that you're going to want to have built into the application. So we'll let it load up here. Log in. So from the Microsoft standpoint, there is a public API that you can get the information from. It's throttled, meaning there's only a certain number of things that you can download at a given point in time. I think it's the same 50,000 limit, so you have to be sort of make sure you code around that. We felt it was important to get a summary of what's been happening and kind of collect some statistics on their throughput and record errors and stuff like that to make sure that we have a reliable download that we can trust over time. Showing you a bit of a search, trying to make some things easy. So oftentimes we're going to have the need to hey, I got this document and it went missing, or we're not sure who was looking at it. So I can type in the name of a document, and we'll get all the information about its access, when it was accessed, who accessed it, etc. If I'm suspicious about a certain user, I can type in D Spears at gravityunion.com and do a user activity search and just see what Dave's been up to. So perhaps if his account was compromised, I could come in here and see where they were looking, what they were doing. We can go and do a site activity search. We could do, so I can type in I can type in the full or partial URL of a site. I'm going to remove the library name here quickly and just sort of see what's been happening in that site. This would be useful if you swore you had a document in a certain site, you weren't quite sure where it was, and it was deleted. You could come in here and find out who deleted that document, or just see what's been happening in the site. Again, we can do a library search as well. lots of capabilities there. So I just simply type in the full or partial URL for a given document library, do a search, and I can see what's been happening in a specific document library. And then just like Office 365, we provide an advanced search. I can choose my sort of workload, what Microsoft refers to as workload. Basically, it's the application in Office 365, and then dig into specific events within that workload. And I can see where we're breaking inheritance or doing, where we restored a folder. I have no idea if this will even return anything, but we can certainly see if we get any information from there. Do a search. Again, we can filter on user ID. That didn't give us anything, but you'll get the idea. Looking at, say, for example, the document search. Show you one more bit there. We can do search for a document. And if you have something, maybe you want to download this as JSON, for example, and give this to your IT team for further investigation. You will get that download of all the critical information. We can do just the current view or get every piece of metadata, whatever you feel is important. But you can do exports for imports into the system, or you can give this to your legal counsel for them to digest it. So that's your search. We have this data. It might be nice to do additional information or to dig into things. So, for example, from a reporting standpoint, I want to perhaps see site activity for a given date range. So I can go in and see, show me all of the activity, the total count. So how many ads, edits, deletes, folder creations per site are we looking at? I can, play with this and see which ones have really only had one, and these may be the sites that we don't want. We can go and clean up, we can go and delete, keep on top of things. We can go in to do some system reports, and I can go see, total activity by IP address, for example. So, which we can then go cross-reference and figure out where the location of these IP addresses are coming from. Is this coming from Canada? Is it coming from the States? Is it coming from Hawaii? Is it coming from Mexico? Or is it coming from overseas somewhere? Again, we can download all of our report information as well and export it. Or we can even go into the system and do a total workload by operation. And we can do list here, click apply, run a report, and just kind of, if you want a visual of what's been happening in your organization, I'll do a bunch of number crunching here, and then we'll pull back an actual visual graph there. I can see all the activity with SharePoint. We can see that no one seems to be working on the weekends, which is totally fine. We can see I can take out SharePoint if I want. Take out Azure Active Directory, take out SharePoint. It'll kind of readjust. I can dive into information, see, oftentimes we roll out Office 365 and not be totally sure if people are using OneDrive. So you can actually see if people are using OneDrive, and if they are, you can go then dig into that further and get that information. So lots of reporting capabilities. From a compliance standpoint, this is probably where it's a little bit different and some stuff that you want to think about. We do have the ability to do legal holds. So this will basically add a layer of protection with your audit trail to prevent people from, or from the audit trail from being deleted from the system. And if I go look at an audit trail, I can put a certain URL on hold, a certain user ID on hold, a certain document ID on hold, or even IP addresses on hold, whatever kind of makes sense from an audit trail perspective, but to give that extra layer of protection in the audit trail. From a workload management, we give you the ability to skip a source. So maybe you just don't, it doesn't really matter from your organization standpoint to collect the information about OneDrive. So that's really for personal stuff. So we can go ahead and skip that source, and then MOAT's not going to download and archive that for you. And then we also give the ability to auto purge. So perhaps you want more than 3 months for OneDrive, but beyond 2 years, you don't care about it. There really shouldn't be corporate records in there anyways. So you really have the ability to give you a little bit more full control and finer grained management over your audit trail. Of course, basically across every single application within the Office 365 platform, Yammer, Compliance Center, Skype for Business, et cetera, et cetera. And then finally, we have the ability to choose. So what's the behavior that I want? I can either anonymize the audit trail for items of destruction. So if I have documents that get deleted or that are run through an official records management destruction process, how do you want to treat that information? Because oftentimes, if we don't deal with it, it still poses a risk. And I have heard of organizations that have had to produce audit trail entries for a document, even though the document was properly classified against the file plan, ran through its proper life cycle, and then destroyed, but you still have the audit entries that the CEO did something or looked at that document and so they had to produce it. So again, the ability to either anonymize that content, remove the PII from it, hold on to what could be potentially important information from an adoption usage standpoint, or we can choose to purge those. So if you don't want to keep those audit trail entries, once items are deleted, you can set a time and you can remove them, and even the ability to go and purge stuff. And this is also available through the API if you need to integrate it with additional things. And then from an admin standpoint, we do have the ability to configure everything about your tenant and we allow you to throttle up or throttle down, etc. So yeah, lots of functionality. If you're building your own sort of tool around archiving, hopefully you got a couple takeaways there. Yeah, if not, obviously we're happy to talk. Yeah, so I think we're kind of got through that pretty quickly. Are there any questions that have come through so far, Jess?
Yes, there are a number of questions. So I'm going to start off with the Microsoft related questions, and there's a few MOAT questions as well.
Okay.
So there's one that I answered, but I want to see if there's anything else you want to add to it. So is this function, and this is the Microsoft 365 auditing, is that only limited to SharePoint?
No, yeah, great question. So if we go to the Compliance Center and look at it, it's across everything in Office 365, and so I can view all activities there. So it's everything from Power BI to SharePoint to Power Apps. We can see Exchange, we have, deleted messages, sent messages, move messages, like everything about Office 365. And what's really cool too is you also have just basic AD stuff. So people who have logged in or who have logged in unsuccessfully, so both that, so Azure Active Directory, Exchange, SharePoint, OneDrive, Teams, basically every application within Office 365. There may be some gaps. I haven't gone through, these are roughly 1,000 different activities and double checked if they're missing anything. And I would imagine that, if you have net new Office 365 applications that have just come out, it may be that the audit trail entries aren't there when they're initially deployed to your environment, especially if you're in a non-US data center. Typically, it's actually hosted in the US first and then moves to your data center. And I think the audit trail entry is tied to your data center. But yeah, it's for everything and every activity. And it's all in one place, which is really cool compared to the on-premise environment where you had to pull your audit trail entries from IIS logs, from Windows logs, from SharePoint logs, from search logs, from third-party tools, and then try and mesh it all together to get information. This is all of your audit information in one spot. Great question.
Great. So does the audit trails related to this activities list? Does the audit also capture what users are searching for example, the search criteria used?
Yeah, I would have to go double check. So there is no, my gut is no, but there would be some additional search logs in the SharePoint search configuration. But there's no, you'll know what document it is, but it's not capturing specific metadata. Like I don't know what the properties are on the document that was viewed. I just know which document was viewed, etc. And so you would know that there was a search that took place and who searched. I could go double check and we can certainly get back to you on that. They do have some search activities in here, but I have to go double check that that JSON data to see if it's being pulled back. But great question.
Great. So what /SharePoint services, for example, timer jobs, does the auditing reporting rely on to work fully?
For the Microsoft stuff or for MOAT?
So I think that's a Microsoft.
Yeah, so a good question. So the audit, I guess technically speaking, in Office 365, you don't have access to custom timer jobs. It is time-based though, and if you go to Google for, or I should say Bing, if you Bing for the Microsoft 365 audit trail, what you'll see is that different applications kind of guarantee you the audit trail entries within a certain time period. So some of them are 30 minutes, some of them are an entire day. So it's more of a batch processing, if you will, of the audit trail entries. It's not quite live, if you will. And actually, maybe I'll give you or two. Another thing that we've built for the environment is, and the reason why it's a tangent is because this won't necessarily be live, but within, say, 30 minutes. If I go into, this is our SharePoint site that we've got a little plugin for this information. If I go to marketing, for example, and I go to presentations, what we've also done is we've surfaced the audit trail. So for example, if I go look at this, the webinar PowerPoint that you saw today, I can either look at all the deleted items for this library, which could be useful. So if I want to come here, and I know I had a document here, but it got deleted, it went missing, you can go and find out who deleted it if it wasn't in the circling bin. Or I can do a little pop-up here and do the MOAT view, and this will show us all the activity for this document. So I can see who has been viewing this document, accessed. We can see extension, which means I had it open and I was working on it. You can see I've been busy over the past couple of days working on the presentation for today. But yeah, being able to surface some of that audit trail stuff optionally if you want, if you think it makes sense, but right in context of a given list, library, or site, being able to see all the information and activities for that content. And the reason why I bring it up now is that, yeah, this might have a 30-minute delay on it because there's a 30-minute delay in the Microsoft Office 365 audit trail. Great question.
Okay, great. A couple of MOAT questions now.
Yeah.
So how long is the MOAT log kept for? Is it 90 days like Microsoft?
Yeah, so basically, and maybe I'll even log into Azure and show you what's happening behind the scenes. MOAT allows you to store the information for as long as you want. So by default, it's going to store that information indefinitely. So this is the Azure Cosmos database that we can see here. We can see we have a bunch of tables in here, and GUMAT, our Microsoft Audit Trail, is you can see all the individual entries in here that you can go in, and you can come and do SQL searches and do all kinds of cool stuff. So all these audit trail entries by default are stored indefinitely, because again, we don't want to make any assumptions about how long you want to store information for. As we saw, if I go to the workload management, I can fine tune that. So if we want to automatically delete everything from OneDrive after 2 years, we can go ahead and do that. And then optionally, we can go in and we can do go into our audit management, and I can choose to purge all entries, say after items are deleted, or I can choose to anonymize them. So really it's up to you. You have full control if you want to store SharePoint audits for 50 years or 5 years, kind of full control over that. Yeah.
Excellent. Okay, so how often is MOAT pulling the audit data from the source?
Yeah, it's basically, we're using an Azure function that wakes up is configurable. So you can set it to wake up every 5 minutes, every hour, every day. So it's really up to you and how close to live do you need. We're obviously limited in the fact that Microsoft doesn't make the audit trails available for up to 24 hours. And then from a Cosmos DB perspective, there's a cost every time you're interacting with the database. I think ours on an average day is like 8 cents per day, so it's not too much, but you want to be careful about not running it every 2 minutes. But we also have a script that you can run. So if you want to do a big historical import in one go, you can do that. But yeah, configurable. You can run it every minute, every hour, once a day, whatever kind of makes sense. Probably the bigger the organization, the more often you're going to want to run the back-end Azure functions to make sure that you're getting all the information on a daily basis.
Great. I think that's almost all the questions. There is one here that I just asked for a clarification from Anon, so I'm not sure who that is, but it is asking about produce the document or the audit trail, ? I don't quite know what that means. So if you do want to clarify, you can jump in and we can answer that. And I'm just checking to see if we have any other questions coming in. I don't see any. So I think we've covered it all. So thank you very much.
Cool, thanks, Jazz. Yeah, again, the SharePoint activity is extensible. So you can do custom reports. You can add additional data sources. So if you wanted to be able to start also collecting information from SAP or network file storage or other applications or custom applications that you've built. You'd be able to pull that data into Azure Cosmos DB and then do reporting on that, as well as any kind of custom integration. So you might be able to do some automated governance if you wanted to automatically delete sites that had low views. Yeah, that was a review.
Yeah, I just got a clarification, Michael. So
yeah.
Just to interrupt you there. So you mentioned that the document was asked for after destruction? Question mark.
Yeah, the document was asked for after destruction. Yeah, so in terms of the example there, so I think what they're asking for is, yeah, so they had a really important document in the organization that had run through its natural life cycle and had been destroyed, but they had held on to the audit trail itself. And so I think in that case, the court had asked them, well, do you have this document? And they said, no, it was destroyed. Here's the disposition certificate. We no longer have it. We did a good job. And then I think the court then asked, well, do you have the audit trail? And they had to go, well, actually, we do. And so they had to go back and dig up that audit trail for the document itself that no longer lived in the system. So important to think about important content and either purge that content as we have built in MOAT and get rid of that stuff. So you kind of want to hold on to those audit trails for as long as you need or as makes sense, certainly longer than 3 months or even a year, and then get rid of it when you can. Or hold on to it. And actually, I'm more in favor of holding on to it because you just don't know. There's so much information there, and you just don't know what's going to be useful 10 years from now in terms of an aggregate adoption, email adoption, usage, teams, et cetera, et cetera. So lots of cool stuff there that we may be able to throw on. And as well as, as everyone's probably aware, artificial intelligence is becoming more prevalent in technology. And so a lot of the, when we refer to artificial intelligence, the two main types are going to be machine learning, either machine learning or machine teaching, and both of those benefit from large data sets. So if you're trying to train your artificial intelligence, which we do have in sort of our MOAT roadmap in terms of being able to look at content and perhaps you can predict, do intrusion detection, or we can figure out when accounts have been compromised, or we can figure out when a deletion has been suspicious. And so the more information we have to train the machine learning or to teach the AI platforms, then the better off we are. So it's super valuable information that you may want to hold on to. But again, that who actually did the activity is only important until the item gets destructed. And so once it's destroyed or deleted or disposed of through records management, who did it becomes less relevant, but the action itself, the fact that I have a document that it was added, the fact that I sent an email, the fact that we held the Teams meeting, all that super critical information that may provide value in the future. And the cool thing about Azure Cosmos DB itself is like the actual cost for storage is pretty minimal. It's really the processing of the content that will cost money. Again, as for it's when it's about 8 cents a day when it's just an average day for us, and I think it's $1 a day if we're doing huge historical migrations, and it'll scale up from there for large organizations. But the storage itself is pretty cheap, so yeah, you're kind of free to hold on to that stuff for as long as you need. Great question.
Just to confirm, the audit trail was required, but they did not have to reproduce the document.
Correct. Yeah, for sure. So they didn't have it. It was destroyed, and it was destroyed legally and ethically according to their file plan. But they still had to produce the audit trail because they held on to it. Typically, if you have it, you have to produce it. So, yeah.
And then we have a cost question that came in. So maybe can you give us an idea on the cost by what you anticipate the size of the audit? And this is related to the cost of storing or moving that data to Cosmos, say for an average user.
Yeah. So on a per user basis, like we're a 25-person organization. And again, for us right now, it's costing us, 8 cents a day for regular usage to download the entire audit trail. And if we're doing huge migrations, up to $1. So I would imagine, larger enterprise organizations, it might be a couple $1,000s per year for all the activity and storage. If you're like, 3,000 or 4,000 person organization, might be a couple $100 if you're, a couple 100 person organization. So it shouldn't be too bad. Yeah.
Great. Thank you. I think that's all the time we have for questions. I don't see any more coming through, but if you do submit any last remaining ones, I will make sure to put that into a summary and we can send that out after the webinar. Thank you.
Yeah, and if you're excited about this and you want to do a demo for your organization, happy to do that. You can find more information at gravityunion.com/MOAT. And then our next webinar. So if you're having problems with adoption, or if you have people that don't like SharePoint or don't like Teams, et cetera, or maybe you've got a SharePoint implementation that you had to rush through because of the pandemic, and you need to circle back and perhaps start to clean up the implementation to drive adoption and get value out of it. We're going to do crafting a great user experience with Teams and SharePoint on March the 25th. So really diving into how can we fine tune that experience, make sure it's as usable as possible, make sure people love the application and the system and use it, which obviously is also a means to an end for compliance, right? So we can't meet our goals around compliance if people aren't actually using the system. So yeah, hope to see you there. Thanks so much for attending today. Jazz, that's all I had. Anything you wanted to add before we end the webinar?
That's it. Thank you, everyone, for making the time. I really appreciate it.
Thanks a lot. Take care. Hopefully we'll see you next month.